when you were with Maharaji, you were sitting in the presence of love as the energy of the universe. And I think Dr. Larry Brilliant said it really well. He was the one who said that, well, we were with Maharaji, he loved us. He said, but that was his job. He was a saint. Okay. He said, the real miracle was that when we were in front of Maharaji, we loved everyone. Guru literally means the remover of darkness. And when you think about that term, the remover of darkness, what removes the darkness is the light. And the Guru is the embodiment of that light. Westerners get stuck on the physical plane. And that includes the brain, the knowledge, not wisdom. Yeah.
Because wisdom is from the heart.
Wisdom's from the heart, right? Yeah.
Hey everyone, welcome to Pursuit of Infinity. I'm your host Josh, and today I'm joined by Parvati Markus. Parvati, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
I really appreciate it. Now, the name Parvati, that was given to you by the great saint Neem Karoli Baba, aka Maharaji, as you guys call him. That translates to like great king, right? A great saint.
Maharaji, yeah. Maha is great, and Raja is king, so it's great king. Yes, yeah.
So the first thing I'd like to ask you is, who were you before Parvati? Tell me about Barbara.
Well, I came to India as Barbara Bach, and I left as Parvati Markus. So it was an interesting journey. I thought it was a good upgrade. I mean, Barbara is barbarian or the stranger, and Parvati is the wife of God. So I was quite pleased with the upgrade Maharaji gave me.
Absolutely. How did you find yourself being called initially to go to India to see him?
Uh, well, by meeting a guy at a party in New Hampshire, and during the psychedelic days of 1969, and this guy saying, "Hey, you want to go meet a saint?" And I said, "Sure, I've never met a saint." And the next day, we drove to New Hampshire to see Ram Dass, who I had never heard of, and that was it. I moved in 2 days, a day later, to Ram Dass's thing that was happening in New Hampshire that summer, and that was where my life went in a completely different direction that it's been on ever since. Yeah.
So, how big of a role did psychedelics play in you finding your way to Ram Dass?
Oh, major. Yeah. I mean, 3 weeks before this guy asked me to go meet a saint, I had taken acid for the first time. And it was interesting because I had been reading Timothy Leary's book, High Priest. And it was the first time I ever heard the words cosmic consciousness. And it was sort of this revelation like, oh, that's what I've been looking for. Those are the words that describe what this yearning has been, so to speak. And so when I took acid for the first time, I went directly into that oneness. And as I came down from that trip, somebody handed me the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And as I read that over the next few days, it was like, yep. It all seemed, right. It all seemed right. And then, we took it for the next 2 weeks, 2 weekends. And then suddenly I was meeting Ram Dass.
Amazing.
So it was really like I had been given the acid so I would be awake enough to meet him. It was, it was a very direct connection. Yeah.
So do you think that if your mind wasn't expanded by those experiences, you may not have been open to going to meet a saint?
It would have been a saint. Are you kidding? They don't exist.
Oh, and what version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead did you read? Was it the version that Ram Dass wrote?
Oh, no,
with
no,
Tim
we're
Leary?
talking 1969. We're talking the original, the Evan Wentz, uh,
The
you know,
original.
the original. Yeah. I mean, there were very few books around at that time, you've got to realize. I mean, there was this sort of little library, shall we say, that all of us wound up reading at that time because they were the only books that were available at the time. So,
Yeah, it was so
yeah.
much harder to find information on this path.
Uh-huh.
And we live in such amazing times now where there's a resurgence of this ancient wisdom and, a dire need to connect with some of the wisdom traditions of
Right.
the East. Yeah.
Yeah. But back then, I mean, there was so little. I mean, there was Autobiography of a Yogi, which became a really important book for a lot of people. You know, uh, there was the Bhagavad Gita. But there was so little. Carlos Castaneda.
So, how did you
Yeah.
first hear about Maharaji in general, and what were your inclinations about him? What were your preconceived notions about just hearing from him from Ramdas?
Well, that's where basically the initial message was just seeing Ram Dass when we drove up the driveway to his house. And he was standing in front of the front door of the main house of his father's place in New Hampshire. And all I could see when I looked at him was light. I mean, I couldn't even speak. I hadn't dropped anything, I hadn't smoked anything. And all I could see coming from him was light. My mind was completely blown. I mean, it was, so that was my introduction to Maharaji
Through Ramdas, yes, it says
through
it's
Ram Dass. It
similar
was
to the book Whisper in the Heart, where you don't necessarily have to meet him in the flesh in the body.
right. Well, I actually met Maharaji before I went to India. I mean, because that summer Ram Dass had given us these little black and white photos of Maharaji and, our New Hampshire wooden malas. And, excuse me. And after that summer, we all went our separate ways. It was getting a little cold there. And I had split a tab of acid with a friend of mine when I got home and was having a very intense trip. And the following day, I was still way up there somewhere. But I was feeling hands reaching up for help. Things were getting a little astrally strange. So I sat in front of this little picture of Maharaji and I just kept saying, I'm scared and you've got to help me. I'm scared and you've got to help me. And the picture suddenly dissolved into blue light and I could see him moving. And it was instantaneous. I mean, it didn't last more than a couple of seconds, but it was enough for me to know that he was there and that everything was okay and I could go through the rest of the trip and, no problem. Well, needless to say, after that, I got a larger picture of Maharaji and I basically lived my life in front of it until I actually got to India and met him. And one of the first things he said to me was, You used to talk to my picture all the time. He said, You asked many questions. So I knew that you could connect with him without meeting his body, which is what made Whisper in the Heart such an easy book for me to do because I understood very much the reality of that possibility.
Yeah, having
Yeah.
had the experience yourself, and
Right.
so many people have had the experience, way
Yeah.
more people than I thought. And there are way more Westerners than I thought that went over to India to meet with Maharaji. Um,
Right.
and in your book, there is a specific description that you had made of the Indian people and how uh, they were surprised by how much less nomadic Maharaji became when the Westerners came over to see him.
Hmm.
Why do you think that was? Do you think he somehow like intuited that you guys were going to come back here and spread the word?
Uh, well, intuitive is an interesting word to use for him. He just knew everything. I mean, it was he wasn't guessing. He knew, what the program was, and he he also, I assume. I mean, I would hate to assume anything in terms of what he thought, but he needed to fill us up with as much as he could within a very short period of time because we didn't have 40 years with him like some of the what Indians did. But the fact that he, for 7 weeks in Kenchi when we first met him, didn't leave other than for a day, here and there, was remarkable to the Indians. Yeah, yeah,
So let's
yeah.
just talk about what it was like to be in his presence, or as they say,
Ah,
darshan, when you got to meet with him in the flesh. What was it
all
like?
right. It was extraordinary because, I mean, none of us ever grow up with the experience of unconditional love. I mean, as much as our parents may love us or our partners may love us or whatever, it's never what real unconditional love is, which is the love everyone, right? When you were with Maharaji, you were sitting in the presence of love as the energy of the universe. And I think Dr. Larry Brilliant said it really well. He was the one who said that. Well, we were with Maharaji. He loved us. He said, but that was his job. He was a saint. Okay. He said the real miracle was that when we were in front of Maharaji, we loved everyone.
Amazing. So
You
what
know,
what is that feeling? What can you describe what it was like? Like what was different between like loving everyone when you were with him and
all right.
then feeling the void of that when you weren't with him?
When sitting in his presence, we were completely absorbed in his being, in that essence. It was he did. I mean, nothing happened. I mean, he didn't give lectures. He didn't teach. There's a wonderful story actually that Ramdev tells, one of the Westerners that was there, which is that here he was. He had a PhD in mathematics from Stanford. So he thought he was very smart. Okay. And here he is. He's sitting there in front of Maharaji, and Maharaji's having a conversation with one of the other Westerners about the price of skim milk in America. And Ramdev is sitting there going, I'm a smart person. What am I listening to this thing about the price of, of skim milk in America? What difference does this make? I mean, he could be teaching us about all sorts of esoteric wisdom, right? And then it suddenly dawned on him, as he put it, or else Maharaji suddenly awakened him to the fact that it didn't matter what the words were. It didn't matter what was being talked about. What mattered was sitting in that energy that was there. And he went into a state of total bliss that lasted, he said, for many, many hours afterwards. So it was sort of like, on one level, you were sitting with this old man in a blanket, all right, who's just hanging out, talking about the price of skim milk in America or about, I mean, every once in a while, of course, somebody would ask him a question like, okay, like, how should I meditate? And it was like, well, meditate like Jesus, when he was on the cross, he loved everyone. Sure. But it was, so not being in his presence and not being held in that um, vat of love, I don't know how to describe it. Um, it's much easier to slip into your mind, into your emotions, into your, you know, stuff.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a wonderful description.
Yeah.
And I really
Uh,
feel it when I listen
uh,
to lectures or I see anything that Ram Dass has ever done. You can really feel the light that he
mm-hmm.
exudes. And I feel like it's got to be very similar, right?
Yes. Well, yes. Even more so.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But it's almost like you can see the
Yeah.
effect, that Maharaji
Right.
had on him, the degree to which just
Yeah.
being in his presence changed Ram Dass.
That's all it took. It was being in his presence. He didn't have to, hit you on the head and give you a name and give you a mantra or whatever. It was like just being in that presence. Yeah. Was enough to affect. I mean, at one point, the first day I was with him, the first darshan I had with him, he reached over and he just very lightly, like with the fingertip, touched the top of my head. And I could feel every cell in my body rearrange.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
So for people who
Yeah.
might not be as familiar with the concept of a guru or might not be as open to
Mm,
accepting the potential, we'll call it magic that a person can embody,
right.
can you just sort of define what a guru is?
Guru literally means the remover of darkness. And when you think about that term, the remover of darkness, what removes the darkness is the light. And the guru is the embodiment of that light, of that energy, of that um, thing. And there's a saying in India that God, guru, and self are one. And so by being devoted to that guru, you are being devoted to that light that is within you as well. So it's also a way of self affirmation to have the reflection of the guru. Yeah.
And is this what Ram Dass meant when, after his stroke, he said he became closer to Maharaji?
Yes, because a lot of the external activity had to die away. I mean, he's half his body was paralyzed. He had trouble talking, all of that. But internally, he was able to spend more time, shall we say, hanging out with Maharaji. So, yes. Yeah.
And did you notice a difference in him? I mean, obviously, there's a difference when, someone goes from being fully functional to having an ailment like that. But did you
Right.
notice any sort of a vibe, or did you
Right.
feel more light coming from him after his stroke? Because I think a lot of people said
Absolutely.
they did. Yeah.
Absolutely. There was a complete difference in what happened with Ram Dass before and after the stroke. Uh, it he had to change. He had to go through that really difficult transition from being the person who took care of everybody else, to the person who was taken care of by everybody else. So independence to dependency, all of that stuff throws you back into yourself, into who am I if I am not the person I thought I was? And so it brought him a lot of humility and it opened him a lot to, how do I say this, to like the more feminine aspects of caretaking. In other words, it was easier for a lot of women had some trouble with Ram Dass. Let's put it that way. He was difficult. He preferred hanging out with the guys. Let's put it that way. And after the stroke, that changed. He became more open to. Um, he just became more open.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And it seems maybe more open to like the maternal nature of being
right.
nurtured and being
Of
taken
being
care of.
nurtured. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
Wow. Amazing. So let's go back to Maharaji a little bit and your story.
Okay.
So let's talk about the story of how he gave you your name. What happened with that?
Actually, it was fairly close to the beginning of the time that we spent in Kenji. I mean, some Westerners had met him earlier, that previous spring, but then um, he had traveled a lot. He at that time he used to travel a lot. He'd be someplace 3 days and then disappear. Um, so let me see if I back up here a minute. Where are we going? I lost
Um,
track.
just how he gave you your name.
Oh, how he gave you my name. So in the beginning, he's just, who did he name first? I'd have to go back and actually look to see. But he started naming the women first. And the day he named me, he named, I think, three or four of us. Yeah.
So
And
what's
then
the meaning?
the meaning of the word of the name Parvati,
Yes, and also,
of receiving a new name. Well,
yes, both.
it's like when you become initiated into something, when you start a new life, receiving a new name sometimes is a symbol of that new life. And I that very much is what it felt like. He was not only raising us vibrationally, uh, internally, but also by giving us a name that was of a much higher vibration than what we came in with, right? So, Parvati, as I said, is the wife of Shiva, and literally means Parvat is mountain in Hindi, and she is the Parvati is the daughter of the mountain, and in her case, the mountain is King Himavan, the Himalayas. So it was something that I could uh, relate higher aspects to. It's a name to live up to.
Yeah, it
you
sounds
know,
like, almost like the concept of a born again Christian. It's like
it's
you're a born again spiritual entity.
right. It's definitely being born again. You're given a new name. Yes,
And it seems that within the Eastern cultures, that death and rebirth concept is very, very important, very integral to Buddhism, to Hinduism.
right.
Um, so did that play a role in your spiritual practice?
What the name?
The name
The,
and the concepts of death and rebirth, was that something that was brand new to you culturally and spiritually?
well, it was brand new to me at the point when I had first taken acid. But then I did as much reading as I possibly could. And certainly after reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and, which is a preparation, it takes you from the time that you're about to die, through the bardos that you go through after you die and into your next incarnation. So it just was, it was one of the bases of sort of the new life, was that understanding. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk about the journey there. I would assume in that time in the 60s and the 70s, it was probably much harder to get there than it is today. So
Yes.
what was the journey like?
Well, that's why I included the journey in Love Everyone. How people got there, because it was an extraordinary journey. Literally, it was going halfway around the world, and you were there without communication with your old life. Getting there, some people, did the old hippie trail, uh, the trek that went through, the bus ride that left from England and went through, places you can't go anymore. They went through Afghanistan, they went through all sorts of incredible adventures on the way there. I took one of the last cheapo Arab charter flights from London to Bombay with 7 stops. One
Wow.
of which was in Cairo. We had a 7-hour layover in Cairo, ran out and saw the pyramids. Um,
Amazing.
but literally, it took, I believe, 2.5 days to fly from London to Bombay.
And was that dangerous, especially as a woman traveling like that? Were you alone
I
or
did not travel alone. I waited till there were a few other people from the meditation group I was in New York who were ready to travel, and traveled with them. Um, I did not ever travel alone as a woman in India, because it was not a good idea.
Yeah, especially down at that time, I would say for sure.
Right. I mean, there was a movie out at the time that sort of portrayed all the Western women as wearing, short shorts and being very available.
I see. Yeah, yeah. That must have been the common misperception of women in
And
America.
right. So it was, we dressed Indian, we dressed modestly, we took care. Yeah. Yeah.
So what was it like? Because you were there, you lived there for quite a while,
A
right?
year. Yeah. For a
So what
year.
was it
Yeah.
like to live there day to day?
It was incredible. I mean, I love India. Uh, and we were with, the Indians that we met around Maharaji, the Indian families, the Indian devotees who had been with him for 40 years were just incredible people and became real family. And uh, I mean, now it would be hard. Now I really don't have a desire to go back to India because most of the people I know are gone, you know, but back then it was really extraordinary. I felt like we were just moving from sort of love boat to love boat. It was um, eh, we met a lot of remarkable people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when I listen to the stories,
Mm.
everyone just seems so generous, giving you food, and
Uh,
I mean, it feels like if I were to go there at that time and step into your shoes, I feel like I would feel like undeserving. Did you guys ever feel any of that?
well, unworthiness is just part of the pot of. The thing is, when you're in front of such a bright light as Maharaji, the light is so bright that anything within you, um, any sort of negativity within you seems much bigger and darker. It's like the shadow it casts in the bright light is so much bigger that so many times you'd find one or the other of us down by the river crying because we were so filled with, guilt or shame or unworthiness or, you know, whatever. And it was people would think, oh, aren't you in bliss all the time being around Maharaji? No, it wasn't always bliss because we had to deal with our own stuff. When the guru is removing the darkness, you have to first see the darkness.
So, did you guys have any practices, or did he show you anything, or have you go see anyone that would help you to dispel some of that darkness that hung around?
The only person he ever sent us to see was Ananda Mahima.
So,
and
what did
and
you
that
guys do when you saw him?
uh, her
Her, my
she
mistake.
yes, Ananda Ma. Ma is the female Baba
Okay.
version of Baba. Okay. And she was a very incredible Indian saint, actually. And so basically, it was, and they were friends, Maharaji and Anandamayi Ma, in whatever level you call those kinds of friendships, saint to
Astral,
saint.
cosmic.
And we would come back from seeing her and he would go, did she feed you? Did Ma feed you? Did she take care of, it was like, but no, he did not teach us lessons. He did not give us practices. He did give people mantra if they asked, but it was not like a formal ceremony type of thing. There was no formality with him. Other Indian, uh, gurus, would have women sitting on one side and men on the other and follow all the Brahmin rules and do all the, not Maharaji. He was beyond all form, all rules, all any of that.
Amazing. So it was
Yeah,
strictly being in the presence of pure compassion
right.
and unconditional love that taught you all you needed to know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it wasn't lessons that you had to learn. I mean, it was all happening from within and it was all very subtle. In other words, Maharaji could be doing something with you that other people would have absolutely no idea what was going on. I mean, for example, these two friends of mine who were married at the time had a big fight one day. And then they came to see Maharaji, and she had had some toast that morning that or something where something wasn't right, something was burnt, something was whatever. But then they had this big fight, and then they went to see Maharaji. And Maharaji looked at her and he said something about, "You didn't eat the burnt toast." Didn't mention the fight, but you knew he knew about it if he knew about the burnt toast. It
Aha.
was that kind
Hmm.
of thing. Like, yeah, you know,
So he had a lot of humor to him.
a lot. We laughed a lot with him. He really, he was amazingly funny and and fascinating. I mean, when we sat there, it was like you couldn't close your eyes and meditate. It was, you just watched him. You just watched him moving or talking, and it was enough. It
Yeah.
was like watching the best TV show ever.
That's a pretty cool analogy. I like that.
you know?
And
Yeah. And
we talk about the the groups of people who were around him, the
mhm,
Westerners coming over, and as I understand, that's referred to as a satsang. But for anyone who doesn't understand that or has never heard that term before, can you describe that for us?
yeah, satsang, is the Hindu way of saying the Buddhists call it sangha. It's the same thing. It's the community of seekers. It's the community of those on the path. So in general, we're sangha, we're satsang, because we're talking about that. Then there's like a specific, the Maharaji satsang, or the Vipassana sangha. It's sort of like your community of fellow seekers.
And this was a pretty
Yeah.
common kind of structural thing with a lot of gurus.
Well, it's just the way it happens naturally. I mean, the Buddha. There's what uh, the three main supports of life is the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha.
Hmm.
Right. In other words, there is the embodiment of it. right. There is the way to live to be that, which is the Dharma. And then there's the Sangha, which is your community along the way, your community on the path. Yeah.
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 So one of the main questions that always permeates my mind when I hear about the absolute beauty and just the amazing experience it must have been to be in Darshan with Maharaji is when you feel that. And as you were describing, when your darkness comes up and erupts and sort of bubbles up to the forefront, and
Right.
then your year ends and you have to come back to America. How do you square these two things? How do you come back into a society with so many sicknesses just permeating
right.
throughout it when you've just been in the presence of pure love?
Right. Well, you hold on tight. when we when we came back, I mean, we literally holed up on what was my husband's father's farm at the time up in Canada, and a whole bunch of us got together that had all left India at the same time, all got together and lived there together, at least until winter came and people couldn't live in tents anymore out in the in the cold in Canada. And very gradually found our way back into, quote, the world. But in the beginning, it was sort of like you just wanted to hold on tight and not let anything sully the experience. I mean, I remember my mother in law giving me a gift of this beautiful pair of leather gloves, and I was horrified. Leather. Oh my God, I can't touch leather. It was, but and I think that's how it started, that we wanted to maintain that connection. And that's how, the group Amazing Grace started and did this Love Serve Remember album and did, all these things started to happen. Gathering Maharaji stories to put into a book, doing, starting to, sort of collect and hold on to as much as we could. Yeah.
And to share. I mean,
And to share it.
everyone,
Yeah.
it seems like everyone, all the Westerners who were over there really came back with the desire to share what they experienced.
Well, it was extraordinary. It was really not everybody. There are people who really went into, went into a cave, so to speak.
Hmm.
There, but for most of us, yeah, there was some way in which it needed to be shared through whatever that individual's perspective was. I mean, Danny Goleman, who then wrote Emotional Intelligence. You know, uh, uh, so he was taking it through the psychology realm that he knew. Krishna Das, of course, eventually took it into music.
Yeah, yeah, it's
You know,
amazing. Now that you bring
so
that up, it's like, yeah, everyone sort of had their own path,
path
and then they
and
allowed Maharaji to
wanted
work
to
through
come
them.
through that path.
Hmm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And your path, he called you his secretary, right?
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes. Well, what had happened is when I had met Ram Dass that summer of 69, 3 days after I moved in, he said, "Can anybody here type?" And I raised my hand and I became his secretary for the summer because, he was answering a lot of snail mail. Remember
Hmm.
that back in those days? Um,
Yeah.
so, so when I came to India, Maharaji said, "Ah, you used to be Ram Dass's secretary. He goes, now you're mine." And in English, he used to say, "Private secretary, private secretary."
Amazing. Yeah, because he had a
Yeah.
translator. You guys would
All right.
speak through his translator, correct?
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. Eventually, some people did learn to speak enough Hindi to know what he was saying. But yeah, for most of us, it was through a translator. And then every once in a while, he'd throw in something in English just to, throw you off.
Hmm. So
Yeah.
is someone like Maharaji born a saint, do you believe? Like as a baby, as a child, what was his life like? Was he always sort of like this mystical being?
We knew nothing about his previous life when we were with him. It was only uh, uh, after he left his body, actually, that we learned that he had been married when he was what 9 or 10 years old, or given in marriage at that age, shall we say, and that he had 4 children, and we didn't know any of that when we were with him. And the people that were in his village, where he was the head man of the village and where he always showed up whenever his kids needed anything or his wife needed anything, they had no idea who he was as a guru.
So even when he was with you guys, he was still taking care of his family and living up to
Yes,
all those responsibilities.
right. But we knew nothing about it. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and
Yeah.
as you guys had said, a lot of people had said actually when they would
Yeah.
be over there in India was he would almost be in two places at once, it would seem. And there are some really
Yeah.
interesting stories about him. I remember there,
Literally. Yeah.
yeah, literally. There was
Yeah.
one that I think is pretty popular where it took place in a barber shop, right? Where he was given somebody was getting like a haircut or something like that. And they were told that their son needed them
Uh-huh.
for something. And I think the guy then traveled to wherever his son was. And I don't know, I'm not sure of the details, but apparently it was Maharaji that was informing him that he needed to go see his son,
Uh,
and this was, halfway across the world.
you're right. Yeah.
Super interesting stuff.
There are some very wild stories. Yeah. But having experienced some of those wild stories, I can tell you they're undoubtedly true.
Yeah. Speaking of a wild story, there was one that really stuck out to me. I
Uh,
believe it was a 9-year-old boy who was suffering from abuse. Can you tell that story, please? That's from
sure.
Whisper in the Heart, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. This is an extraordinary tale. I mean, here's this 9-year-old boy who had been through years of intense sexual abuse with groups of men. I mean, we're talking, nasty stuff. And he comes home from school one day, and he was the youngest. So, and he was home first. The others were still in school. His parents were at work. And he sees that like the front door of the house is like blown open, and the window is upstairs is blown open, and like a bomb went off in the house. And it's getting dark. This is in Australia, by the way. Takes place in Australia. And and he's terrified. He doesn't know what's going on. And this gentleman comes over and wraps him, puts a blanket around him and just basically says, it's going to be all right. And that's all he remembers. He sort of fogs out about what happened after that. Um, 25 years later, uh, he had been married, had well, more than 25 years later, he had two teenage sons, and finally gets divorced from an abusive woman. He naturally winds up in an abusive marriage because that's what he knows. And he finds himself out on the balcony one day of this high rise that he's moved to, with the mountains on one side, the oceans on the other. And he finds himself with one leg over the balcony and about to go over and jump. And he suddenly hears this voice saying, "You are loved. You are loved." And this big wave of love comes towards him, and he goes, "Oh, what about the boys?" And he comes back. And many years later, he's in the States and he sees either a book cover or a magazine article, something or another that has a picture of Maharaji. And he goes, "Oh my God, that's the blanket that was put around me." And then he looks at the man wearing the blanket and he goes, "And that's the man who gave me the blanket." He says, "I'll never forget that date." He goes, it was September 9th, 1973. September 11th, sorry,
Mm,
911. September 11th, 1973. And I go, "Oh my God, that's the day Maharaji left his body." He didn't know that.
wow, amazing. What do you make of a story like that? How does the
I,
Western mind comprehend that?
I, who knows? I mean, it's beyond the mind. It's just completely beyond the mind. That's what Westerners have to understand, that there are some realities that are simply beyond the mind. You're never going to know.
Yeah, that's our
that's
problem, right? One of
that's
our
why
many
it's
problems.
that's why it's called the Great Mystery.
Mhm. And luckily,
Yeah,
psychedelics have been coming back. There's a giant resurgence of them, and I think that
right.
they're very important for people like us who don't really have any cultural roots in any wisdom tradition, so that we can be
Mhm.
broken out of our paradigms.
Right.
And for me, if it wasn't for psychedelics, I wouldn't have been traveling down this path. I would not know who Maharaji is. I wouldn't know who you are, Ram Dass.
Mhm.
And I think psychedelics are just, they're so important for that. And it seems like a lot of people have traveled to India and have traveled down the path of the East as a result of their experiences from these substances.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, Maharaji was fine with acid. I mean, he called it the yogi medicine. He, as a matter of fact, he told Raghu when his father came over, he says, "Give your father the yogi medicine." When
Oh,
Raghu was
that's
like,
an incredible story too. I heard Raghu tell that story about going through Benares with his father on
right.
acid. Oh man,
Yeah, yeah,
amazing.
we were with him on the boat. It was like waiting. I mean, here Maharaji told him to take acid, We expected like instant enlightenment or something. I mean, talk about a lesson in expectation. But it was sort of old acid, and what it did was it just gave him enough opening as we walked around Benares and saw, a dead cow and a dead person, and saw cremation and had this sort of encounter with death, that he was able to open up to it because he had had just enough of the
Yeah.
acid. Yeah.
Can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about the significance of Benares for anyone who doesn't understand or isn't familiar?
Well, Benares, I believe, is the oldest sacred city on earth. It's been sacred to Shiva, to Lord Shiva, for many, many, many thousands of years, and probably looks exactly the same as it did then. Um, it's on the Ganga. It's on a place in the along the river that was always felt to be very pure, even though the water in the Ganga is, as we know, not what you would call clinically clean. And a place where people would come to die because Lord Shiva would whisper Ram Ram in their ear as they were dying and would liberate them that way. It was sort of the final place to come for liberation.
So when you would go
Yeah,
there, you would be confronted with a lot of death and a lot of
right.
unfiltered death, right?
Well, yes, because if you've never seen a cremation, I mean, here, a body is in a cardboard box and shoved into a tube into an oven, and you don't see what's going on. In Benares, they would be piling up the wood and laying out the body and piling more wood on top and lighting it. And around the pyre, there'd be kids playing and animals doing their thing and whatever. And it was just a normal part of life was seeing death. Yeah. I mean, you could pass, I mean, there would be a lot of people who came to die. And so they would come with just enough money to buy the wood needed for their fire. Or they would die on a street and people would start putting rupees or coins there to collect the money to put them to burn them.
So what was like the
Yeah.
mood or the vibe or the atmosphere of the people who were going there to die? Were they going there peacefully? Were they going there and feeling sort of a pride because they were going there, with the intention of having like a beautiful
Uh,
ceremonial death, so to speak? Or was it
n-
still sort of like a sketchy situation?
no, it was devotional.
Hmm.
It was really devotional. It was people who had lived their lives uh, within a system. Sorry, within a system of belief. You know that said that if you come to Benares to die here, you will be liberated. And they were people that would be seeking to have that freedom, to have that release. Yeah.
Hmm. Did Maharaji ever talk about death or sort of try to uh, inform the Westerners kind of, or maybe sway their idea of what death was? Because I'm sure he understood that we have a very skewed perspective of what death is.
As I said, he didn't teach. There were no lessons on death other
Mm.
than, things that were completely could be completely confusing. I mean, he could say black one day and white the next day about the same thing. I mean, there was he wasn't stuck on any one point of anything, if that makes sense.
Like a
Uh,
living paradox or something.
right. I mean, for example, there are stories of somebody coming to him and saying, one of your old devotees has just died. And he wept, tears coming down. Another time, somebody came and said, so and so has died. And he started laughing. And it was like, what are you, a butcher? I mean, why are you laughing at this person's death? And it was like, he said, why? Should I be one of the puppets?
Yep, there's the humor again. So it seems like there's this strange paradox between
uh,
like everything he said and did was calculated, but he was still here now in the moment and not living in the future or the
yeah.
past.
Yeah. Calculated is a bad word. It sounds like there's intent to make things happen a certain way,
Hmm.
Whereas I think he was just so in the moment and everything in that moment was available to him, whether it was the past or the future or whatever. And whatever the optimum thing was for that moment was what he did. That
Yeah.
was, yeah.
Ramdas had, talked about that when he told the story about how he gave Maharaji acid. he said that essentially Maharaji was already living there all the time and had access to those realms. So it wasn't really anything new to him.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. He said yogis knew about this thousands of years ago.
So
Yeah.
can you talk about, let's just say, what's one of the most impactful stories that you could tell about being with Maharaji? Would you be able to tell that for us?
Um, well, it's funny because it seemed like a little thing at the time, but it's something that has left a very large imprint on me, so to speak. And I think I wrote about it in Whisper in the Heart, which was that when I was in India, I was smoking beedies. Beedies are these terrible little cigarettes. It's a tiny bit of low grade tobacco wrapped in a betel leaf. And they're awful, but that's the way it was. I was smoking them anyway, but I wanted to stop. I had basically started smoking them to hang out socially. And then I really wanted to stop, but I was sort of, getting addicted to them. And I came in one day to see Maharaji, and Maharaji looked at me and he said, "Stop smoking beedies." Okay. So I gave away my pack of beedies. And after lunch, he called me back up to congratulate me on the fact that I had stopped smoking beedies. And he said, "I'm the CID of the heart." The CID is the Indian equivalent of the CIA.
Mm,
And that line, "I'm the CID of the," he knew that in my heart I wanted to stop. So he told me to stop. But the fact that that line, "I'm the CID of the heart," that he knows what's in your heart, had a very big
amazing.
impact. Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about,
Yeah.
like, as we're beginning to wrap up here, because we're approaching an hour, and I do want to be respectful of your time.
Uh,
There's a lot of stuff in the news nowadays about UFOs, UAP, all these extraterrestrial, non-human entity or non-human intelligence type of things.
right.
And we talk a lot about that as well as psychedelics and esoteric stuff on this podcast. A lot of our episodes recently have been about like this phenomenon. Was there any indication as to like how a great saint like Maharaji would feel about this type of topic? Like, or do they have any sort of insight within Hindu wisdom about this type of thing?
Well, he certainly never discussed it as far as I know. I don't
Hmm.
think Maharaji ever mentioned UFOs or aliens or whatever. Um, but then again, this is a multidimensional being. And whatever plane of consciousness other beings from other planets, from other galaxies, from other whatever might have, he would be able to be in touch with that.
Hmm.
So, uh, but did that mean he said anything about it? No, no,
Because one of my
yeah,
my main interests in this world, one of the things that
yeah,
really gets me going is the merging of these two like opposite facets of reality and of life. This path that we're on here
hmm,
in Western capitalistic society, where we're being guided by materialism, but underneath that is a foundation of technological innovation. The need to continuously evolve our intelligence as opposed to
hmm,
our wisdom. And then, the other side of that, which is the spiritual life,
right,
the traditions of, shamanism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of these other aspects of reality. And,
hmm,
my concern is that I feel like humanity needs to merge these two things to become what we're destined to be. And I always just search through these wisdom traditions and through anybody who has the knowledge as to like any type of way we can do that. To me, it's just super important that we merge these two things. And for us in Western culture, we are missing so much of that spiritual side. So in your opinion, what can we do? What should we do? Because For me personally, I'm not sure if you've ever heard the phrase FOMO. Have you ever heard of this phrase before?
I just heard it from Pete Holmes, was the one who finally told me what it was.
Of
Yes.
course, it sounds about right coming from him. But I mean, this is something that I have just
Yeah.
a dramatic FOMO,
All
in terms
right.
of not being able to meet some of these people, Ram Dass and Maharaji. So, what do you say to people like me who are really seeking to merge these two facets of reality, but do have that FOMO feeling?
Well, no, I don't have it at all because I was there.
Hmm. Yep.
um, but uh, it's all within. I mean, if God, Guru, and Self are one, and you are seeking that being that removes the darkness from within you, look within. Look at the darkness until the darkness turns into light. I mean, there are so many ways to work. And there are so many different pathways to take into knowledge of the capital S self. You know, there are so many ways to do that. And as you can see in Whisper in the Heart, which are all stories of people who, quote, met Maharaji since he left his body, so it's like none of that happened on the physical plane. But and so people think, oh, well, I must be nuts to have an experience like this, or, and then they find out all these other people have had those experiences as well. So, hey, you know what? Maybe, maybe these things that happen beyond the physical plane or below it or beneath it or next to it or wherever it is, interwoven within it, is real. Westerners get stuck on the physical plane, and that includes the brain, the knowledge, not wisdom. Yeah,
Because wisdom is from the heart.
wisdom's from the heart. Right. Yeah. But there's so many ways to work. That's what there is a lot of now, is there are a lot of teachers out there who can show you a way to start chipping away at the darkness and letting more light in. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
And, you learn as much as you can from that one. And when you've had enough, you wait for the next messenger to show up. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Parvati, I really, really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom and for sharing all of your stories. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank
And
you.
as we begin to wrap up here, do you have any links, any places people can find you, anything you want to share, any events, anything like that coming up?
Um, well, let's see. Love Everyone and Love Everyone is the book that is the stories of the Westerners who actually went to India and met Maharaji. And Whisper in the Heart, as I said, are the stories of those who have met him since he left his body and never met him, quote, in person, except for a few who did. But it's, um, so, and then I have another book called Isabella Castaspella, The Happy Little Witch and Her Friends, which is in the process of getting developed as a animated TV series. So that's sort of where I've been putting my energy right now, is that, and in working with a lot of people who are doing their memoirs at this stage of life. Because a lot of us who are with Maharaji are now in our 70s and 80s, and it's time for them to tell their stories. So I have been working with quite a number of people who are with Maharaji who are now telling their stories, and their books will be out.
Amazing. Well, thank
Yeah.
you for sharing. Thank
Yeah.
you for um, bringing all the wisdom that you've brought back, and just continuing along the path and continuing to share what Maharaji had to say and had to show.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk about them. So.